The morning Elijah Coles lost the contract that was supposed to save his business, he pulled over on the shoulder of I-285 and found $20,000 in cash sitting in a bag that nobody on earth would ever trace back to him. He sat in the van, engine running, hands on the bag. $1,900. That was what was left in the business account. Payroll was due in 3 days. 4 people, 4 families, 4 sets of bills that had nothing to do with his bad luck and everything to do with whether he showed up for them on Friday. The money in his hands wasn't a temptation dressed up as an opportunity. It was a solution, exact, untraceable, already his if he decided it was. He thought about Darnell, who had 3 kids and a car note he never talked about. He thought about Keisha, who had pulled him aside last week, end of a shift, voice low, and asked whether things were going to be okay. He thought about what he could tell them all on Friday if this money quietly became part of the account. The story he wouldn't have to tell, the conversation he wouldn't have to have. Nobody would know. He sat with that thought for 11 minutes, felt its full weight, turned it over like a stone. Then he drove to the nearest police station and turned the bag in. He told himself on the way there that he'd find another way. He told himself integrity was non-negotiable. He told himself all the things a man tells himself when he's making the hardest kind of right decision, the kind that costs something immediately and promises nothing in return. He wasn't sure he believed any of it, but he walked in, set the bag on the counter, gave his name, and drove back out into a Tuesday morning that looked exactly the same as it had before, except that he was still broke and now had no excuse not to be. He called his team into the break room that Thursday afternoon. Darnell, Keisha, Reggie, who had worked for 4 other cleaning companies before this one and had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather, and his nephew, Trey, 20 years old, hired the previous summer as a favor, stayed because he turned out to be better at the work than anyone had expected. Elijah set a box of donuts on the table, bought with the last of his personal checking account. Then he sat down and told them exactly where things stood. No cushioning, no managed optimism, no version of the truth that made him look more in control than he was. The contract was gone. He had enough for this week's payroll. Next week was uncertain. He told them they should start looking just in case, and that he was not going to lie to them to buy their loyalty or their patience. The room was quiet for a moment. Darnell looked at the table. Then he looked up. "You paying us Friday?" "Yes." "Then I'm here Monday." He picked up a donut. "We figure the rest out together." What Elijah didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he had lain awake the night before, running numbers in every direction he could think of and found no version that worked, that he had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before walking in, trying to find language for what he needed to say that didn't sound like a goodbye, that on the drive over, he had thought about the bag on the side of I-285 and felt for one ugly moment something uncomfortably close to regret. He had found no better words, so he said the true ones. He drove home that evening past the stretch of I-285 where he had pulled over. He didn't look at it, but he felt it the way you feel a place that has already decided something about you. The weeks that followed were the kind that strip a person down to what they are actually made of. He cut his own salary to 0, drove Darnell's Thursday route himself to save a shift, stayed late to cover gaps without making anyone feel like they owed him for it. He pulled out an old notebook, the kind with a cracked spine and water damage on the cover, and wrote down every client he had ever served, 61 names, every apartment complex, every medical suite he cleaned after Saturday programs when the chairs still smelled of coffee and the floors held the scuff marks of 100 people who had needed somewhere to be. He started calling from the top of the list. He bid on 3 new contracts in the first month, lost all 3. One had gone to a competitor who, word in the industry said, had quietly paid a facilities manager to make the decision easy. Another went to a company whose insurance had lapsed. They won on price, no one checked the paperwork. A third went to the lowest bidder, regardless, the way these things sometimes simply do. He sat at the kitchen table the night he lost the third one and did not move for a long time. His wife, Diane, sat across from him. She did not soften the numbers or offer him a version of events that made them more survivable. She looked at what was in front of them and let it be what it was. "You could have kept that money," she said. One time, quietly, not as accusation, as the fact it was. "I know," he said. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark running the same calculation he had run in the van, the one with no clean answer, and understood something he hadn't let himself understand before. That the decision on the side of I-285 had not just cost him $20,000, it had cost him the comfortable belief that doing right had any reliable mechanical connection to things going right. That was the belief that made the decision feel survivable in the moment, and it was gone now. What was left was simpler and harder. He had done it because he was the kind of man who did it. That was all. There was no guarantee attached. There never had been. He got up the next morning and kept calling. On the 43rd call, a woman named Phyllis O'Coffer picked up on the second ring. He knew the name before she spoke. She had been the office manager at a downtown law firm 7 years earlier, one of his first corporate accounts. He had cleaned that office for 14 months before they located and signed with a larger vendor. He remembered Phyllis specifically because on the Monday morning after his crew's very first job, she had left a handwritten note on the front desk, "Best we've ever had. Thank you." He had kept it in his glove compartment for 3 years, only thrown it away when it finally fell apart in his hands. "Elijah Coles," she said, and her voice had the tone of someone who had been expecting a call they'd forgotten to make themselves. He almost said something professional, controlled, something that protected how much he needed this. Instead, he told her the truth, that he was fighting to keep his business alive, that he was calling people he had served honestly, and that he wanted to know if there was anything he could do for her. A pause, not long, but the kind that carries weight. "Can you come in Thursday?" He almost said yes without thinking, caught himself, made himself ask what scale of operation she was working with, because if it was beyond what he could currently handle, he needed to say that before the meeting, not inside it. She told him it was more than he could currently handle, significantly more. "I'll be there Thursday." Phyllis O'Coffer was no longer an office manager. She was the director of operations for a property management group that oversaw 32 commercial buildings across metro Atlanta, medical offices, corporate suites, mixed-use developments. She had thought about Elijah 7 months earlier when their primary cleaning vendor had failed a health inspection at one of their medical buildings. She had spent that entire Saturday personally re-cleaning 2 floors because she couldn't find anyone she trusted on short notice, And the whole time she was doing it, she kept thinking of a crew that had never once left her with a reason to come back and check their work. She had searched for his company that day, found an old website, couldn't locate a working contact form. Her schedule moved at a pace that didn't allow for follow-up on dead links, so she filed it away and moved on. She had not forgotten him. Thursday morning, Elijah pressed his best shirt the night before and arrived 8 minutes early. He sat in the lobby and told himself one thing: say only what is true, not what sounds good, not what wins the room, what is true. She asked about capacity. He told her exactly where he was. 4 core employees, 1 van, hiring would be required, timeline was real. She asked about pricing. He gave her honest numbers, not discounted numbers designed to get in the door and renegotiate later. She asked what made him different from the 3 larger vendors she was currently evaluating. He thought about it, didn't rush the answer. Because I'll tell you when something is wrong before you find out yourself, and because I've never sent a bill for work I didn't do. She looked at him steadily. He felt, in the silence that followed, the specific discomfort of a man who has just said something true in a room where something polished was probably expected. He thought he had lost her. He was certain of it. He ran through the things he could add, statistics, references, a growth trajectory, and found that none of them felt more honest than what he'd already said, so he said nothing. She slid a folder across the table. Start with 4 buildings. First 90 days are what I expect. We talk about the rest. He kept his face still, shook her hand, walked to the elevator. The doors closed. He pressed the lobby button. Then he put his back against the wall of the elevator and let out a breath that felt like it had been held since the morning he pulled over on I-285. The first 90 days were not a victory lap. They were the hardest stretch of sustained work his team had ever done. He hired 2 additional workers within the first 2 weeks, bought a second van on a payment plan whose survival depended entirely on the contract holding, drove the numbers every night with the focused dread of a man who knows exactly how thin the margin is and chooses to move anyway. There were nights he woke at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark doing the math again. There were mornings he sat in the parking lot, the way he had sat on the shoulder of I-285, holding something heavy, and had to work to talk himself out of the van and into the day. There were moments, brief and unwelcome, where he thought about the bag, about what 14 months of that money could have looked like instead of 14 months of this. He never let himself finish the thought. He got out of the van. He went to work. And around him, quietly, something was assembling. Darnell had become the kind of lead worker who made other people better just by being in the same building. Keisha had taken on quality checks without being asked, moving through finished spaces with an eye that caught what others missed. Reggie, steady, watchful Reggie, who had worked for men he couldn't trust and learned the difference, had become the crew's quiet backbone. And Trey, his nephew, who had come on as a favor, had built a scheduling system from scratch that cut route time by 20% and made Elijah look, by comparison, like someone who had been guessing. They had all stayed, not because the money was exceptional, because something about the way Elijah had told the truth in a break room on a Thursday afternoon made them decide to. 90 days passed, then 100, then 12 buildings, then 20. 14 months after the morning he had found $20,000 on the shoulder of I-285 and driven it to the police station, Phyllis Okafor called him into her office and set a master services agreement on the table, all 32 properties. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked back at the document. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind during the worst nights, used it like a man uses a distant light to keep moving through dark water. Sitting here now, The paper solid under his hands, the numbers real, the signatures waiting. He felt something he had not expected. Not triumph, not vindication. Relief so complete it felt like grief. Like something that had been braced for a long time was finally, carefully allowed to set itself down. He signed it on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he had lost the contract that nearly ended everything. The same day of the week he had sat on the side of a highway and made the choice that felt in the moment like the most expensive thing he had ever done. He thought about what those 11 minutes had actually built. Not just the business, something structural. Something in Darnell's loyalty, in Keisha's pride in her work, and Trey's willingness to outgrow the job title he'd been given. In the way his team moved through spaces, with care, with accountability, with the quiet confidence of people who worked for someone who told them the truth. He had not built that with the contract. He had built it in a break room on a Thursday afternoon with a box of donuts and no good news. Integrity, he understood now, was not a value. It was infrastructure, built in secret, load-bearing, invisible until the moment everything else is tested against it, and then the only thing still standing. Some things we do not know we are building. Some debts we do not know we are collecting. Some hands we cannot see are already moving, long before we understand that anything is in motion. And some choices that feel like loss turn out in the end to have been the most important investment a person ever made. Most people would have kept that money. Be honest, would you? This is God's Hand Stories, where every story has a hand behind it you didn't see until the very end.